The rain had been falling since 4 o'clock, and by the time the lamplighters came out along Piccadilly, it had turned the colour of pewter and the temper of a thing that meant to keep falling for the length of a man's natural life. James Ravensgate had been riding back from Westminster with his collar high and his hat brim low, and he had been telling himself that the chill in his shoulders was nothing more than the consequence of a debate which had run an hour past its useful end, when his bay mare stopped on her own at the corner of Sackville Street and would not be pressed forward. He looked up to see what she had seen, and what she had seen was a young woman standing beneath the awning of a stationer's shop, with her hands held close at her waist, and her shoulders held in that particular careful way that a person holds her shoulders when she is trying not to let anyone see that she is trembling. The awning was a poor one. It dripped at 4 separate places along its edge, and one of those places was directly above the crown of her head. Her bonnet was a dark colour, which had been a darker colour an hour ago. Her gown beneath the open pelisse was the same emerald silk she had put on at 3, for the optimistic reason that it was October and the sky had been clear, and the optimism of it now ran in a line of water from her hem to the cobbles, and gathered at her boots, in a way that told him she had been standing under that awning for at least a quarter of an hour. He swung down before he had finished telling himself to. "Madam," he said. She did not turn her head fully. She turned it the necessary fraction to acknowledge that a man had spoken, and then she addressed her answer to the line of railing across the street, which was not where he was. "I am quite well, thank you." "You are not." He had crossed the pavement before he heard himself say it. He had unbuttoned his greatcoat before he heard himself doing that, either, and he had lifted it from his own shoulders and set it across hers before either of them had agreed that he might. She made the small, involuntary sound that a person makes when warmth lands suddenly on a part of her that has been cold for too long, and then she stiffened and tried to take the greatcoat off again. "You'll be soaked through, sir." "I have a horse. You do not." "I'm waiting for an hour, I should think." She looked at him then. The lamp at the corner had only just been lit, and the light from it caught the side of her face and the wet at her temple, and he registered 3 things in the same breath. He registered that her eyes were the grey of clean slate. He registered that her mouth was the mouth of a person who had not eaten since breakfast and was too tired to mind. And he registered that she was young, younger than the gravity of her bearing had at first suggested. Perhaps 26, no more. "I'm waiting for a cab," she said. "You will wait an hour more before one stops in this rain. My groom is at the corner. I will send him." "That is very kind, sir, but I cannot." "My name is Ravensgate." He bowed, in the rain, with his head bare and his hair already plastered against his brow. "James Ravensgate. If you find it improper to accept the offer of a stranger, I beg you will find it less improper to accept the offer of a duke who happens to be standing in the rain looking foolish." The grey eyes considered him for the space of 2 breaths, and then the mouth did a thing he did not at the time understand the value of. It softened. It softened in the corner only, but it softened. "Mrs. Heath," she said. "Caroline Heath." He chose, then and there and without examining why, not to ask the obvious follow-up question, whether Mr. Heath was at home, whether Mr. Heath was waiting for her at an address she was about to give his groom, whether Mr. Heath existed at all. He bowed again, more shortly, and lifted his fingers to his lips and whistled once. Down the line of railings the groom's head came up, and the groom's heels came down, and within the space of a minute the boy was at his elbow. "Tom, a hackney, quick!" "Your Grace." The boy was gone. Ravensgate turned back to Mrs. Heath, who was holding the lapels of his greatcoat closed at her throat with one gloved hand, and who had not, after all, given the greatcoat back. "You are very wet, sir," she said, with the careful courtesy of a woman accustomed to being looked at and accustomed to not appearing to notice it. "It is October. I shall recover." "You have not put your hat back on?" "I have not, no." "It is a great deal of trouble for a stranger." "It is no trouble at all. May I ask where you are bound?" She hesitated. He saw the hesitation. He did not press it. "Half Moon Street," she said at last. "The east side. Number 12. "Half Moon Street," he repeated, fixing it. "Tom will see you to the door. He has my coat upon his arm. You will tell the driver the direction. Will you give me your gloves?" She looked at him as though he had spoken in a language she had recently mastered but did not yet trust. "My gloves?" "They are wet through. I have a pair of dry ones in my saddlebag. They will be too large, but they will be warmer than the ones you are wearing, and you have at least 11 minutes of cab ride ahead of you before a kitchen fire." She drew off the wet gloves slowly. He registered, in the catalogue of registered things, that her hands were not the hands he had expected. They were the hands of a woman who had at some recent point in her life lifted and carried things that wanted lifting. Her fingers were long, the knuckles a fraction roughened, and there was a fine streak of ink along the side of her left middle finger that the rain had blurred but not quite washed away. He gave her his gloves. They were too large. She put them on anyway. "I shall return your coat, Your Grace," she said. "There is no occasion to." "There is every occasion to." "Then it must be at a moment when you are not at risk of further pneumonia." She almost smiled. He saw it. He stored it. The hackney rolled to the corner with Tom on the box beside the driver, and Ravensgate handed her up himself, because the step was high and the cobbles were slick. As she settled inside, his greatcoat heaped about her shoulders, she leaned forward and looked at him from beneath the dripping brim of the bonnet that had not, in the end, saved her. "Why?" she said. "Why what, madam?" "Why this? You did not know me a quarter of an hour ago." He had been asked many questions in his life. He had answered most of them adequately, and a few of them well. This one, he answered with whatever came first to his mouth. "Because you were trembling," he said, "and there is nothing I am less able to bear, in this world, than the sight of a woman trembling under a thing that ought to have been a roof." The cab started. He watched it to the corner. He watched until it turned out of sight into the lamp-lit grey. Only then did he climb back onto the bay, who had been waiting with the patience of the female sex. And only then did he discover that his teeth were chattering after all. He arrived at Ravensgate House in Hanover Square some 20 minutes later, dripping onto the marble of the entrance hall, and was met by his butler with an expression which conveyed, all at once, that something had occurred in his absence, that something was disagreeable, and that something would not, alas, be improved by the absence of a greatcoat. "Your Grace." "Marsden." "Your Grace's coat." "Was lent to a woman in the rain. Tom will return without it." "Mr. Carmichael is in the study, I assume?" "He is, Your Grace. He has been for above an hour. He says it cannot wait until the morning." James Ravensgate climbed the stairs of his own house with a wet ridge of hair across his forehead, and a piece of news in his solicitor's hand which, on the face of it, ought to have driven Caroline Heath, the awning at the corner of Sackville Street, and the grey eyes of Clean Slate entirely out of his mind. They did not. It was an unsettling discovery, and he would notice it again at intervals across the evening. But he did not, at this point in the story, understand what to do with it. Mr. Carmichael rose as Ravensgate entered the study. He was a man of 50, with the habits of a man of 70. He had served the Ravensgate dukedom for 19 years. He had served the late Duke through the catastrophic 4 winters that had ended in the present Duke's accession. And he had served the present Duke through the 3 winters since, and his face wore the careful pallor of a man who has just been told a thing he had hoped not to be told this season. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the hour. You have been my father's solicitor and mine for almost 2 decades, Carmichael. You may forgive yourself the hour. What has occurred?" Carmichael produced from the leather pouch at his side a sheaf of paper, bound at the corner with red tape. He laid it on the desk, and turned the topmost page with the careful precision of a man laying out a chessboard. "Marbury has filed in Chancery this morning. The motion is for a writ of partition and an account. He is claiming, in form, that the estate is improperly held, that the conveyance of 3 winters ago, by which the late Duke's debts were retired, was procured by what he calls— Carmichael paused and read from the page. An undisclosed party operating without lawful standing. Ravensgate did not, for the moment, sit. He stood at the desk, with one hand braced against its edge and the other hanging at his side, and he read the line a second time, as Carmichael's finger traced beneath it. Undisclosed party, he said at length. He means the patron. He means the patron, Your Grace. He has been asking that question for 2 years. He has been asking it. He has now learnt the trick of asking it in chancery. The patron. 3 words which had stood at the centre of Ravensgate's adult life, in a way he was, in his quieter moments, ashamed to admit. 3 winters ago, when his father had finally collapsed beneath a debt of £40,000 and a year of unanswered creditors, when the bailiffs had been at the lodge gate, and the Ravensgate name had been within a week of public sale. A bank draft for £40,000 had arrived at this very desk in an envelope addressed in a hand James Ravensgate had never seen, drawn upon Coots, and signed only by a clerk of the trust. There had been a single sheet of paper enclosed. It is the wish of the undersigned, the sheet had said, that this draft serve to retire in full the encumbrances upon the estate and house of Ravensgate. The undersigned desires no acknowledgement, no return, and no inquiry as to the identity of the giver. The undersigned wishes the Duke of Ravensgate well in his new tenure. It had been signed simply, a debtor of the late Duke, who has at last come into a position to pay. 3 winters. 3 winters of trying not to think too often about who the debtor had been. 3 winters of accepting, slowly, that some debts cannot be repaid, because their creditors do not wish them to be. 3 winters of building the estate up around a piece of paper which had asked, in the gentlest possible terms, never to be asked about. And now, Marbury. What does he hope to do, Carmichael? He hopes, Your Grace, to compel disclosure. If the patron is named in court, the conveyance becomes a matter of public record. If the patron's standing is impeachable, if he or she had any kind of disqualifying connection to the estate, or any improper motive, or any history of insolvency, or any of a dozen things, Marbury will move to set the conveyance aside. If the conveyance is set aside, the debt revives. If the debt revives, the estate is once again exposed to its creditors. If the estate is exposed, Marbury moves in. Marbury moves in. It was an old story between the cousinship. Edmund Marbury was Ravensgate's distant cousin on the paternal side, the only male issue of a line which had once been the elder line, until a marriage 3 generations back had quietly stripped it of its consequence. Marbury had grown up in the modest house his father had been able to afford, and had grown up watching the Ravensgate carriages turn into the Ravensgate gates. And Marbury had, for a quarter of a century, mistaken the chance of birth for an injury done to him personally. He had been waiting for the Ravensgate dukedom to fall over since he was 16 years old. He had very nearly seen it fall over 3 winters ago. He had not entirely forgiven the patron, whoever the patron was, for catching it. Ravensgate sat down at last. He folded the paper carefully and tapped it once on the desk, and looked across at Carmichael with the steadiness he had taught himself in the first month of his tenure, which was the steadiness of a man who has no intention of letting his solicitor see him afraid. How long do we have? 6 weeks to file a response. The court will hear the motion the 3rd week in December. And the patron? Carmichael paused, and Ravensgate registered that the pause was not, this time, a lawyer's pause. It was a friend's pause. Your Grace, I've been asked by the Patron's Trust on 3 separate occasions across the last 3 years to give certain warnings should the question ever come into court. I have given those warnings in writing to the Trust's principal solicitor as recently as Michaelmas. I have not received a reply. The Trust is a blind one. I do not know the patron's name. I do not know the patron's address. I know only the name of the solicitor who handles the trust, and that gentleman is a man of such professional rigidity that I would sooner ask a stone for the time of day than ask him to break a confidence. You know the name of the trust solicitor? I do. Tell me. Carmichael hesitated. Mr. Pinsent, Your Grace, of Lincoln's Inn. Pinsent. Ravensgate sat with the name a moment, turning it. Send word, in the morning, that I should be glad of a quarter of an hour with Mr. Pinsent at his convenience. Send word also that I do not intend to ask him a single question about the identity of his client. I intend only to ask him whether, in his professional judgment, the client wishes still to remain undisclosed in the face of a motion that may unmask the client without consent. Your Grace, he will refuse to meet you. He may refuse. Let him refuse for himself. And Marbury? Marbury we will address tomorrow. I am too wet tonight. Carmichael allowed himself the very small smile he permitted himself once a quarter, when his Duke said a thing his late father had been incapable of saying, and he gathered up his papers and tied them once more with red tape, and bowed himself out into the corridor. Alone, Ravensgate stood and walked to the window. The rain had thinned. The square below was empty. A single hackney was turning out of the south corner, with its lamp lit, and its driver hunched, and its passenger invisible behind the streaming glass. And James Ravensgate, Duke of Ravensgate, watched it go, and thought of a woman in an emerald silk gown the colour of the river under summer, with the rain running off her hem, and a name that had been given to him with a hesitation he had registered, but had not, at the time, examined. Mrs. Heath, she had said. Caroline Heath. He thought of the ink along the side of her left middle finger. He thought of how she had said the address. Half Moon Street, the East Side, number 12, with the slight emphasis on the words that a person uses when she is repeating a thing she has only recently learnt to say aloud. He thought a number of other things which, at 8:30 on a wet October evening, in the first hour of receiving notice that a man in Lincoln's Inn was about to drag his life into court, were not things he had any business thinking at all. The hackney with the dripping lamp set Caroline Heath down outside number 12, Half Moon Street, at 7:20. The groom, Tom, handed her down with the careful neutrality of a servant who has been instructed, by a master who is no longer in the carriage to instruct him, to behave as though the master is. He carried the greatcoat as far as the threshold, and there, at her request, returned it to her arms. He bowed. He took his fee, which she pressed upon him though he protested, and he went. The butler at number 12, who had been Caroline's father's butler and was now Caroline's, opened the door himself, and stood without speaking for the space of 3 seconds, while he registered what his mistress had upon her shoulders and what she did not have upon herself. Miss Heath?
Stevens?
You are very wet, Miss Heath.
I am aware of it.
Mrs. Tilney has set a fire in the small saloon.
Tell her there will be no dinner. A tray in my room.
And the... She lifted the wet greatcoat slightly.
Stevens, I shall need a tailor's pressing and a clean wrapping, and it must be returned tomorrow before noon. Address it to Ravensgate House, Hanover Square. There will be no card.
If Stevens had ever heard a more interesting sentence spoken on the threshold of number 12, Half Moon Street, his face did not, in this hour or any of the hours which would follow over the coming 6 weeks, allow that fact to be inferred. Very good, Miss Heath. She climbed the stairs. She did not look at herself in the looking-glass at the first landing, because she did not wish to see her face yet. She climbed to her own dressing-room, where Sarah, the maid, was waiting with 2 warmed towels and an expression that managed to convey both relief and inquiry without troubling her mouth.
Sarah.
Miss.
There has been a kindness from a stranger. I shall need to think about it before I can speak of it. The gown is ruined. I do not mind. Lay out the indigo, please, for the morning. I shall not be dining. Yes, miss. It was an hour later, in her own sitting room, with the fire built up and the windows shuttered, and a single glass of warmed wine standing untouched at her elbow, that Caroline Heath did at last allow herself to look at the name she had not, until this point, allowed herself to think. Ravensgate. She had been 26 for 2 months. She had been the head of her own household for 3 years. She had been the principal of a blind trust, established at her own request and entirely without her family's knowledge before her father's death, for the same 3 years. She had been the patron of the Ravensgate estate for the same 3 years. She had never seen the Duke of Ravensgate. She had seen him, this evening, on the corner of Sackville Street in the rain, with his hat off and his hair plastered to his brow. And she had given him a name which was not, strictly, an untruth. Caroline Heath had been her mother's name, and her own, but which had been chosen for the express purpose of not being a duchess's name, or a viscount's daughter's name, or any of the things which might cause a man with the bearing of a duke to look at her with the particular eyes that men of his class had been looking at her with for 3 seasons. He had not looked at her with those eyes. He had looked at her with the eyes of a man who had registered that a person was trembling and had failed, in some essential function of his being, to walk past. She set the wine down without drinking it. She rose. She crossed to the small desk by the window, lifted the lid, and drew out, from beneath 2 folded letters and a pressed sprig of last summer's lavender, the worn paper which was the only paper she ever kept in that desk drawer. It was a letter, 4 years old, 3 sides written in a hurried, boyish hand, which had run out of room near the end, and had crossed itself at right angles in the manner of a brother who has run out of paper before he has run out of things to say. It was addressed to her. It was signed, simply, Robert. Her brother had been lost at Waterloo, of a chest wound he had carried for 2 days, in a barn outside Mont-Saint-Jean. He had not been lost alone. He had gone, his sergeant had written her afterwards, with his hand in the hand of his commanding officer, who had refused to leave him, though 3 other men of the same rank had been waiting on the same officer for orders. The commanding officer's name had been written in her sergeant's letter, and she had read the name once, on the morning the letter had arrived, and she had then folded the letter and put it in the drawer with her brother's letter, and had never opened the sergeant's letter again. She had not needed to. She had read the name once and had remembered it, and the name had been Ravensgate. The man at Waterloo had been the present Duke's father. The present Duke's father had been carried off, 3 years afterwards, by debts. The present Duke, 25 years old, had inherited a name and a house and an income which would not cover the wages of the household for a single quarter, and Caroline Heath had read in the morning papers, on a Tuesday in October 3 winters ago, that the bailiffs were at Ravensgate Lodge, and the gates were to be sealed against creditors by the end of the week. She had risen from the breakfast table that morning, gone into her father's library. Her father had been 5 years gone by then, and the library was hers. And she had drawn out the small leather-bound ledger in which her solicitor kept the running total of her private estate. She had read it. She had drawn out a pen, and she had written a letter to Mr. Pinsent of Lincoln's Inn, which she still kept a copy of, instructing him to establish, by the close of the following week, a blind trust drawn upon Coutts in the sum of £40,000, to be applied to the discharge of the debts of the estate and house of Ravensgate, with the express stipulation that the patron be never named and the recipient never troubled by inquiry. She had never told a living soul. She had not told her brother's sergeant. She had not told her butler. She had not, in 3 years, told the man whose father had held her brother through a night which she did not, even now, allow herself to imagine in any detail. She had told herself, when she had signed the instruction, that she was doing it because Robert's last letter had asked her to do what was needful for the family of the man who had held him through his worst night. She had told herself that the giving would not feel like a thing she was doing for herself. This was true. The giving had not felt like a thing she was doing for herself. It had not felt, until this evening on the corner of Sackville Street, like a thing she was doing for a stranger at all. She set the letter back in the drawer. She closed the lid. She sat for some time at the desk, looking at the closed lid of the desk. And at last, because she did not wish to lie to herself this evening, she said aloud, in the lit and quiet room, the thing she had not, even in private, said before. "He has very dark eyes," she said, "and he is younger than I had imagined." She rose after a while and went to bed. She did not sleep until the late hours of the morning. She did not, in the end, sleep at all. By 11 the following day, the greatcoat had been pressed and folded and wrapped in clean linen and delivered to the back door of Ravensgate House, Hanover Square, by a manservant from a job house who had been hired for the purpose and dismissed at the corner. The card on it had been Caroline's instructions. No card. The butler at Ravensgate House had received the parcel with the polite suspicion of a man whose master had returned the previous evening without an overcoat and had at no point in the intervening 14 hours looked once at the breakfast that had been set before him. By 11:15, Marsden had laid the parcel on the desk of the study with a note attached in his own hand. The note read only, "From Half Moon Street, Your Grace." No card. The porter who delivered it would not give a name. By 11:30, Ravensgate had finished his morning's coffee. He had read the note. He had registered the address. He had set the note down. He had risen, and he had said to Marsden, with the careful politeness of a man trying not to be observed in what he was about to do, that he believed he would walk this morning, and that he would be home by 1. By 11:45, he was on Half Moon Street. He had not, at any point in the 400 yards he had walked, settled the question of what he was going to say. He had settled the question of which house he was going to say it at. Number 12, the east side. He stood on the pavement opposite and looked across at it for the length of time it took him to ascertain that the door was painted a soft grey, and the brass plate beside it bore no name, only the number, and that the windows of the first floor were dressed in curtains of a heavier weight than was customary, and that on the second floor a window box still held, in late October, 3 pots of dark-leaved herbs, which had been recently watered. He crossed the street. He climbed the 3 steps. He rang. The door was opened, after the necessary interval, by a butler of middling age, with the very particular still face of a man who had been told, an hour ago, what he was to say to anyone who came to the door wishing to see Miss Heath. "May I help you, sir?" "His Grace the Duke of Ravensgate, presenting his compliments to Mrs. Heath." The butler's face did not change in any way, which a less practiced observer would have caught. Ravensgate caught it. The butler's eyes went, for the space of 1 heartbeat, to a point above and behind Ravensgate's left shoulder, where there was nothing. Then they came back. "I am sorry, Your Grace. There is no Mrs. Heath at this address." "Is there a Miss Heath?" The butler considered. The butler had been a Heath butler for 11 years, and had been instructed once and once only by the present Miss Heath, on the morning she had inherited her father's estate at 23, that he was at no point to lie to a gentleman on her doorstep regarding her identity, but that he was at every point to spare her the awkwardness of a name she had not chosen to give. "There is a Miss Heath, Your Grace." "I see." Ravensgate had taken the half-breath that a man takes when a thing he had half suspected has been confirmed. He did not flinch from it. He held it. "Will you be so good as to ask Miss Heath whether she would receive me, and convey my apology for the irregularity of the application?" "Your Grace's card." "You may say that the gentleman who came to the door is the gentleman she met at Sackville Street last evening. You need not, in the first instance, say anything else." The butler bowed. The butler closed the door. The butler climbed the stairs with the steady tread of a man choosing not to hurry. 3.5 minutes later, the door was opened again, and Caroline Heath stood in the doorway of her own small saloon in a morning gown of an indigo so deep it was very nearly black, with a bone-coloured shawl at her shoulders, and she watched the Duke of Ravensgate cross the threshold of her house with the steady eyes of a woman who had already, some time in the last hour, decided that there was no point in pretending. "Your Grace?" "Miss Heath." The use of the proper name landed between them with the small, clean weight of an admission. He bowed. He bowed properly this time, as a gentleman bows to a lady in her own drawing room. She closed the door behind him. "You knew," she said.
"I did not know. Your butler has confirmed it. I had suspected, when you gave the name yesterday evening, that you were not Mrs. Heath. I did not, until now, know that you were Miss Heath."
"What gave it away?"
"You said the address as if you had recently learned to say it aloud." She considered this for a moment, and then she did the thing she had done once the day before, at the corner of Sackville Street. The corner of her mouth softened.
"That is observant of you, sir."
"It is the unfortunate habit of a man who has spent 2 years in Chancery."
"Will you sit down?"
It was not a question. He took the chair she indicated, which was opposite a small fire and a low table on which a coffee service had been laid out, and from which no coffee had yet been poured. She poured for him. Her hand, he registered, was perfectly steady. He registered also that her cuffs at the wrist were not quite at the wrist, which was the small slip of a woman who was dressed in haste and turned them back too far, and he found the slip touched him in a way that nothing about her composure had. "Will you tell me why you came to my door, Your Grace?"
"I had thought to thank you for returning my coat."
"You have a butler to do that."
"I had thought also to apologize for the impertinence of yesterday's address. I addressed you as a married woman. You did not correct me. I should not have asked, but I had no business assuming, and I have come to express my regret."
"You have not asked."
"I have not."
"You came to my door, Your Grace, to find out who I was. You had every right to. I gave you a false name."
"You gave me the half of a name. I do not consider that a falsehood."
"That is generous of you."
"It is not generous. It is accurate."
She set the coffee pot down. She folded her hands in her lap. She lifted her eyes, the grey of clean slate, he confirmed, in this light, and held his. "Your Grace, I will not lie to you in my own drawing room. I am Miss Caroline Heath. My father was Viscount Heath of Westmore, raised to the peerage by the Prince Regent in 1808. He has been gone 5 years. I am his sole surviving issue. I live at this address with 3 servants and a housekeeper. I am unmarried. I am of age. I am at no immediate risk of pneumonia, and shall return your kindness as best as I am able, once I have decided in what coin the kindness ought to be returned. Is there anything further you would wish to know about me before we proceed to coffee?" "There is," he said, "but I shall not ask it today." "And what is it that you will not ask today, Your Grace?" "I shall not ask," he said, with the careful steadiness of a man who has read a great deal in a face across a coffee table at noon, "why you have not married. I think the question is impertinent on a first call. I think also that I would not, if you answered it, know what to do with the answer." She looked at him for the length of 2 breaths. She poured a second cup.
"That," she said, very quietly, "is a useful kind of restraint, Your Grace. I shall remember it."
And then, because she had not yet decided what to do with her own restraint, and because the morning was cold and the coffee was warm, and the man across the low table had eyes the very dark color of wet bark in late autumn, she lifted her cup, and she drank. They spoke for the next 40 minutes, of small things and one large one. They spoke of the rain in the afternoon, and the season's slowness in starting, and the inadequacy of the awning at Hatchard Stationer, which had, Caroline observed, lost 3 of its supports the previous winter and never been mended. They spoke of the Foundling Hospital, where the Duke held a place upon the board, and where Miss Heath, it transpired, had taken to attending the Sunday committee in her father's old chair. They did not speak of patronage. They did not speak of Chancery. They did not speak of why the conversation, at the second cup, had begun very gradually to incline toward the future tense. When he rose, at the chime of 1, she rose with him, and walked him as far as the doorway of the saloon, and no farther, because she had drawn the line of her propriety there, and had no intention of moving it within the first hour of his acquaintance.
"Will you call again, Your Grace?"
"I will call again."
"When?" Tomorrow, if you will receive me. I will receive you. He bowed. She did not curtsy, quite, but she inclined her head with the precise economy of a woman who would not be condescended to under her own roof. The butler closed the door behind him. She stood for some time in the empty saloon, with her hand still upon the back of the chair he had been sitting in. The coffee in his cup had been finished. The coffee in hers had not. She found, on examining the cup, that she had spent 40 minutes drinking very nearly none of it. This struck her as ridiculous, and she laughed once, briefly, into the quiet room. And then she said aloud the second sentence she had said aloud in this house in the space of 24 hours. "He must not know," she said. She said it to the chair, because the chair was the nearest object available, and she said it with the particular flatness of voice that a woman uses when she is making a promise to herself, which, she suspects, even in the saying of it, she will find difficult to keep. "He must not know that I am the patron. Not yet. Not in the middle of a chancery suit. Not while Edmund Marbury was filing motions and trading on rumors and dragging her father's name and her brother's name and her own name across the corridors of Lincoln's Inn. Not while a public revelation would force the Duke of Ravensgate into the false position of having to acknowledge a private debt at the moment most likely to make the acknowledgement look like an arrangement. Not while she had only just begun to discover what the man at Sackville Street had looked like at the corner of his mouth, when a stranger had nearly smothered him from beneath a soaked bonnet. He must not know. She rang the bell. "Stevens, I shall write to Mr. Pinsent this afternoon. He will need to come to me at his earliest convenience. Send a boy." "Yes, Miss Heath." "And Stevens." "Miss." "I'm at home this morning to no one but His Grace." "Very good, miss." By the third week, he had called 11 times. By the fourth week, he had called 20. Half Moon Street, which had been the quietest address on its side of Piccadilly for 3 years, had become a small puzzle to the keepers of the neighbouring houses, who had taken to glancing out their windows at the sound of the Ravensgate carriage, and had taken also to making the kind of remarks, over tea, which were not yet quite the kind of remarks which would be reprinted in the morning broadsheets, but which were, in the natural progression of such remarks, on their way. He had not, in 20 calls, said anything to her which would have given a chaperone pause. He had, in 20 calls, said a great many things which would have given a chaperone pause if she had heard the way he said them. By the third week, she knew that his mother had been lost at his birth, that his sisters were 2 and married, and lived respectively at Yorkshire and at Bath, that his father had been a man who loved his county more than his children, and had loved his children better than he had loved himself, that the late Duke had served at Waterloo as a colonel of foot, and had returned from it 3 stone lighter and 10 years older, that the late Duke had wept once in his son's presence, on a January night in the 2nd year after Waterloo, and had said only that he had not been able to save them all. By the third week, he knew that her mother had been the daughter of a Bristol shipping merchant, that her father had loved her mother and had grieved her loss with the steady and unornamented grief of a man who did not believe his daughter ought to be made to share it, that her brother Robert had been 6 years her elder and had been the steadiest creature alive between the ages of 2 and 20, that Robert had taken his lieutenancy in 1813 and had been at Quatre Bras 2 years later, and at Waterloo the day following, that Robert had not, in her opinion, ever fully understood what was about to happen to him on the morning of the 18th of June, and that this was the only thing she did not, in 23 years of loving her brother, forgive him for. He did not, in the third week, ask her whose hand had held her brother's at the end. She did not, in the third week, volunteer the answer. She was determined, between Tuesday and Friday of the fourth week, that she would not allow herself to feel for him what she had begun to feel for him, until she had concluded the chancery business in such a manner that the feeling could not be made to look transactional from the outside. This was a sensible determination. It lasted, as such determinations generally do, until Friday afternoon at 4:15, when she opened a parcel which had been delivered by a porter in the Ravensgate livery, and found within it Not the volume of Coleridge's letters, which she had requested from him at his last call, but a small carved horse of cherry wood, no larger than her thumb, with one ear chipped, and the saddle strap whittled in a hand which she knew very well. She knew very well, because she had watched it whittled at Westmore Park in the summer of 1810, when her brother Robert had been 14 years old, and had been spending 3 weeks of August carving wooden horses to give as Christmas presents to the children of the tenants. She had been 10. She had sat at his elbow on the bench by the river. She had watched the saddle strap take shape under his thumb. She had not seen the horse since the Christmas it had been given. She sat down where she stood. There was a note in the parcel. It was in Ravensgate's hand. It read, in 9 words, "I found this at the bottom of his desk." She did not, for some time, do anything at all. After a quarter of an hour, she did the thing she would later, in less guarded moments, allow herself to call the moment she had given up on the sensible determination of Tuesday to Friday. She rose. She put on her pelisse. She walked, without taking the carriage, the 8 minutes from Half Moon Street to Hanover Square, and she went to the back door of Ravensgate House because she did not, this afternoon, wish to be seen at the front. She rang the back bell. The butler opened the door, registered the lady upon the step, and let her in without a word. Ravensgate was in the study. The carved horse was in her hand. He rose when the butler announced her. He did not, in the moment of rising, finish whatever it was he had been writing. "Miss Heath." "Where," she said, "did you find this?" "At the bottom of my father's desk. It was wrapped in a piece of waxed paper. There was no note. I have only just opened the drawer this week. We have been a long time in setting his papers in order. I did not know whose it was. When I had it in my hand." "You guessed?" "I guessed. The whittling is the whittling of a boy. The wood is cherry. He whittled it at Westmore. I would have known the hand. It is in the way he cuts." "It is." "He gave it to my father, I think." "He gave my father a great many things he ought to have given me, and 1 or 2 he ought to have kept for himself. I had not known he had given anything to yours." "I had not known either. But the date on the waxed paper." He turned and lifted a small folded square from the desk and held it out. He had written the date upon it, in his own hand. June the 18th, 1815. He had been carrying it, I think, in the morning. He had not, by the evening, been able to deliver it. She took the waxed paper. She unfolded it. The date was in her brother's hand, and underneath the date were 2 further words written hastily in pencil. "For him." The room went very quiet for the count of 4. He waited. He waited as a man waits beside a person whose grief has just been handed back to her after 7 years of being put away. After some time, she said, without looking up, "Thank you." "There is no thanks, Owing." "There is. You did not have to bring it to me." "I would have had to bring it to you if I had had to carry it on horseback to Devonshire in a snowstorm." She looked up. Her eyes were wet. They were not, by any stretch of the term, weeping. They were the wet of a person who has registered that an act of attention has been performed for her and has not yet decided what to do with it. "That is a very particular way to speak, Your Grace." "It is." "Why?" "Because I think you have, for some time, been carrying a thing for me which I have not been told about. And I think that the carving of my father's horse, even at second hand, is the smallest fragment of the return I would be willing to make if I knew what to make it for." He had not, in 9 words, said it. He had 9/10 of said it. She closed the waxed paper carefully and laid it on the desk. She lifted the small carved horse and put it in his hand and closed his fingers about it. She did not let go of his fingers immediately. "Keep it," she said. "He gave it to your father, not to mine. It is yours." "I cannot. You can. It was meant for him. He would have wished you to have it. And—" her breath caught for a moment, and then she steadied herself. "And it is the only thing of my brother's which I have ever given to anyone." I should like to know that, when I have given it. It was to the person who would understand what it weighed. She let his fingers go. He put the carved horse carefully on the desk beside the waxed paper, with the precision of a man laying down a thing he intended, at some near point, to take up again. "Will you stay?" he said. "For coffee?" "For coffee?" "Yes." She stayed for coffee. They did not, on that afternoon, speak of patronage. They did not speak of chancery. They did not speak of the date upon the waxed paper, or the boy who had not, by the evening of the 18th of June, been able to deliver his Christmas present in October. They spoke of the carved horse, and of the river at Westmore, and of a fishing lesson Robert had given her at 8, and which she had failed at, and of how Robert had not, in 8 summers of fishing, ever caught a fish. She left at 5:45. She walked home. That night she lit the candle by her desk only briefly, and she opened the drawer where the 4-year-old letter was kept, and looked at it once before closing the drawer again. She had not needed to read it. She had read it in the last 3 years, often enough to recite it. The first move from Edmund Marbury was a small one, and not, to a person who did not know Marbury, particularly alarming. The second move was less small. The third move arrived on the morning of the 2nd of November, in the form of a paragraph in the Tatler's Eye, a broadsheet of the lower kind, which had been a great deal less reputable 5 years ago than it had since contrived to make itself, and which printed on its 4th page, beneath a sketch of a hackney horse, the following observation. "It is whispered in the better drawing-rooms of the West End that a certain great house, lately come into the hands of its present holder by an arrangement which his late father did not, in his lifetime, see fit to disclose, has recently been receiving the attentions of a certain unmarried lady of considerable but recently acquired fortune, whose family connection to the late establishment cannot, by the most generous reading, be called distinguished. The connection between the unnamed lady and the irregularity of the conveyance is at present unproven. That it ought to be proven, in the interest of the public, is the considered opinion of this paper." Ravensgate read the paragraph at 7:20 on the morning of its publication, in the breakfast room of his own house, and read it 3 times to be certain he had not misread it. Then he set the paper down. He stood. He sat. He rang. "Marsden." "Your Grace." "Send to Mr. Carmichael. I want him by 9. "Yes, Your Grace." "And Marsden." "Your Grace." "My carriage at 8:30. "Where shall I direct the coachman, Your Grace?" "Half Moon Street." She had read it before he had arrived. The Tatler's Eye had been delivered to her own table at 7:30, because she had instructed Stevens, 3 weeks ago, that any and every broadsheet which made any reference to the Ravensgate matter was to be on her plate at breakfast. She had read the paragraph once. She had folded the paper. She had finished her coffee. She had put on the indigo morning gown and the bone-coloured shawl, and she had sat in the small saloon with the carved horse upon the mantel. Ravensgate had returned it to her last week, in its waxed paper, with a note saying it was, after all, hers. And she had waited. He arrived at 8:20. The carriage had moved quickly through quiet streets. He came in without his hat, which was perhaps the smallest thing she registered, and which was, she thought afterwards, the one which had moved her most. "Miss Heath." "Your Grace." He did not, this morning, sit down at once. He stood at the small fire, with one hand at the mantel and the other in the pocket of his coat, and he addressed his first sentence to the carved horse, which was the most truthful witness in the room. "I have come," he said, "to ask you to marry me." She drew in her breath. "Your Grace." "Hear me out, Caroline. I had intended to ask you this question several weeks from now, in better circumstances, with the Chancery business settled, and the autumn behind us, and a Christmas at Ravensgate planned, with such modesty as my present income permits. I have been carrying the question with me since the 2nd week of our acquaintance. I have not, until this morning, presumed to ask it. I am asking it now, because I will not have you read in the paper that I have been receiving the attentions of an unmarried lady of considerable fortune,
without also reading, by tomorrow, that the unmarried lady is engaged to be married to me, and that the question of fortune does not, in the case of the engagement, signify.
It does signify. The paragraph is the entire problem.
It is not the entire problem.
Your Grace, I love you, Caroline. I have loved you, I think,
since you said the address of this house aloud in a hackney at the corner of Sackville Street. I had thought it would take me longer to understand that this was the case. It is not. I will not have you marked in print as a woman of doubtful family who pursued a duke for the cover of his name. I will not have your honor traded across the counters of Marbury solicitors. I love you, and I will say so in church before December, and I will say so under cross-examination if I must. If you will not have me for love, take me for the cover. Take me for whatever you find available. But for the sake of God and your brother's name, do not refuse the protection that I am at this moment, by every right I have, offering you. She had risen. She did not know, in the moment, that she had risen. She crossed to the fire and stood on the other side of the mantel from him, with one hand on the cherrywood horse, and she said, in a voice that was not, even to her own ear, quite the voice she had begun the morning with, I will not take you for the cover, Caroline, and I will not, this morning, take you for love, Caroline. You are doing the right thing for the wrong reason. You are doing it on the day the paragraph has come out. You are doing it before Carmichael has spoken to you. You are doing it without... Her throat closed for a beat. The next word would have been a betrayal, and she would not, even at the height of her objection, be the first to break the line of restraint they had held between them for nearly a month. You are doing it without all the information. What information am I missing? She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. I will write to you this afternoon, she said. Will you go now? Will you write to me this afternoon? I will. You will not, in the interval, do anything which I would, on receipt of the letter, beg you not to have done. I will not. You give me your word. I give you my word. He left. She wrote the letter. She wrote 3 drafts and burned 2. She sealed the 3rd. She gave it into Stevens's hand. Then she went, in the indigo gown and the bone-coloured shawl, to Lincoln's Inn, because the time had come, at last, to break the trust. Mr. Pinsent of Lincoln's Inn received her in a room which smelled of old leather and good tobacco, and the particular damp of a court that had been in continuous use since the reign of Charles II. He was a small man, 63 years old, immaculately dressed, with the kind of stillness which most people mistake for severity, and which a very small number of people recognize as the stillness of a man who has, in 40 years of practice, learned to hold his face in such a way that no client ever leaves his office wishing he had said less. Miss Heath. Mr. Pinsent. He did not, this afternoon, offer her tea. He had read, 3 weeks ago, the same paragraph that had appeared this morning in the Tatler's Eye, with the difference that he had read it as an unpublished draft on the desk of a colleague at Marbury's chambers, where he had been on other business. He had been, ever since that hour, the most carefully composed and the most quietly afraid man in Lincoln's Inn. You have come, Miss Heath, to instruct me to discontinue the blind trust. I have come, Mr. Pinsent, to instruct you to disclose it. Not discontinue. Disclose. To whom? To the present Duke of Ravensgate. By a letter from your hand, in your office, this afternoon, if you can manage it. Addressed to him at Ravensgate House, Hanover Square, conveying the identity of the patron and the substance of the original instruction of October 1812. Pinsent did not, for a moment, reply. Miss Heath, I am aware of the irregularity of asking it of you. The instruction at the time of the Trust's establishment was for perpetual non-disclosure. I am the principal of the Trust. I am of age. I am of sound mind. I am instructing you to amend the perpetual non-disclosure clause to a disclosure to the Duke, and to the Duke alone, with my signature and seal upon the amendment in your presence this afternoon. The disclosure is to remain confidential to him.
It is not, on any account, to be made known to Mr. Marbury or to Mr. Marbury's representatives. Miss Heath, you understand that any disclosure made by my hand in writing may, in Chancery, be subpoenaed by the opposing side. Marbury is within his rights to compel me to produce my correspondence with the Duke if he can show cause. I understand. You understand also that if the disclosure becomes a matter of court record, your patronage will become a matter of public record,
and the consequences for your reputation. I understand, Mr. Pinsent. I understand them very thoroughly. I will not have the Duke ask me to marry him without knowing whom he is asking. The slightest, the most fractional change moved across the face of Mr. Pinsent of Lincoln's Inn. It was not a smile. It was the muscular cousin of a smile that lawyers permit themselves once a decade. Miss Heath, you will sign the amendment in this office in 20 minutes' time. I will draft it in your presence. The letter will be at Ravensgate House by 5:30. I will, on this occasion, deliver it myself. Thank you, Mr. Pinsent. It is not, I beg your pardon, it is not, I think, a small thing you have asked me to do today. I have asked you, Mr. Pinsent, to do the thing my brother would have asked me to do had he lived to see this morning. I have asked you to behave as though the courts of England were a place where the truth might still occasionally be heard. I am sorry to make the request of you. I am not, at this point in the matter, willing to ask it of anyone less honest than yourself. He bowed. He said nothing further. He drafted the amendment. She signed it. The letter went out by Pinsent's own hand at 5 o'clock. The boy at Ravensgate House received it at 5:20. Marsden took it up to the study at 5:30. Ravensgate had been at the desk for 2 hours, writing nothing. He broke the seal. He read the letter. He sat at the desk for a quarter of an hour without moving. Then he got up. He did not, at any point in the quarter of an hour, ring the bell. Caroline returned to Half Moon Street at 20 minutes to 7. She climbed the stairs to her own sitting room. She did not go to the window. She did not light the second candle. She sat in the small armchair beside the fire with her hands folded in her lap, and she did the thing she had not, in 3 years of being the principal of a blind trust, allowed herself to do at any point. She let herself believe, for 1 full minute, the worst thing it was possible to believe. He had courted her for the connection. The proposal had come, not from need, but from calculation, the only kind of need a duke could afford. He had not known, yet, that she was the patron when he had come to her this morning. He had suspected. He had suspected for at least a week, perhaps longer. The carved horse had been a test, deliberately laid. Pinsent's letter would confirm what he had already begun to assemble in the second drawer of his father's desk, and the marriage would be the elegant resolution he required. A Duchess of Ravensgate, who, by virtue of being a Duchess of Ravensgate, could not be subpoenaed against the Ravensgate interest, and whose patronage, on becoming the property of her husband at the moment of the marriage, would cease to be evidence of an irregular conveyance and would become, instead, the unimpeachable settlement of a bride upon her own husband's estate. He had not lied to her. He had loved her. He had loved her precisely as much as he had needed to. He had asked her in the same hour the paragraph appeared because, by the calendar of his own interest, this was the hour the asking was most needed. She had been a season's diversion, no more. She had been the convenient solution to a chancery problem. She had been a fool to believe that a man of his standing had, in fact, stopped his horse at Sackville Street because she had been trembling. She held the belief in her hand for a full minute. She held it the way one holds a hot iron, without setting it down, without dropping it, registering the burn. At the end of the minute, she set the belief down, deliberately and without ceremony, and she rose, and she crossed to the writing desk by the window, because she had promised, before she had let herself believe the worst, that she would not act upon any version of the worst until she had heard from him directly. The letter she had written him at 3 was already in his hand. The letter Pinsent had written him at 5 was now also in his hand. She had given her word. She would, on her word,
Wait. She waited. She waited until midnight. She waited until 2.
At 2:15, when no carriage had stopped, no letter had come, and no knock had been heard at the door, she allowed herself the second and final luxury of the evening. She rose from the chair by the desk, and she stood at the window in the dark, and she looked out at the empty street, and she said aloud the second sentence of the day she had not been able to say in the light.
"I will leave by 2:15, she said, "and I will not write to him again."
She was, when she said it, already in the position of having waited until 2:15 without him having written to her. She was using the language of futurity to dignify a thing that had, in plain fact, already happened. She knew this. She let it stand. She went to bed at 3. She did not sleep. The letter from Ravensgate arrived at 9:30 the following morning. It had been written, the postscript said, at midnight, and held back from the post by his own hand because he had wished to deliver it himself, and had, in the end, decided that the irregularity of presenting himself unannounced at Miss Heath's door at 5 minutes past midnight was the kind of irregularity which Miss Heath would, in her present mood, be entitled to refuse. Caroline broke the seal at her own breakfast table, with Stevens standing as far across the room as the room allowed. The letter was 4 sides long, and was not, in any of its 4 sides, a calculation. It read, in part, "You have asked me what information I was missing. Pinsent's letter has supplied it. I am writing to you now because I understand, having read his letter twice, that I am the most ungrateful living man in Britain, and that this is a thing you have known about me for 3 years, and have not, by the kindness of your own hand, mentioned. I do not know how to address you. I have spent the hours between 5 o'clock and now, turning the question of what I owe you in my mind, and I have concluded, in the end, that what I owe you is in no way related to the conveyance of October 1812, and is in every way related to the woman who stood at Sackville Street on a wet evening last October, and was, in spite of everything I now know about her, prepared to give me her gloves. I withdraw, by this letter, the proposal of marriage I made you yesterday morning at 8:20. I withdraw it because I do not wish you ever to be in the position of wondering whether I asked it because of the conveyance, or because of the paragraph in the Tatler's Eye, or because of the Chancery suit, or for any reason at all other than the one I gave you. I will make you the same proposal again, if you will let me, on a day when none of these other reasons are in operation. I will make it at Christmas, or at Easter, or at any hour after the suit has been settled and the paragraph has been retracted, and the patronage has, by my own action and not by yours, been placed beyond any imputation of impropriety. I will make it when the only thing left in the room is the question of whether you will have me. Until that hour, I beg you to consider yourself in no way committed to the proposal of yesterday morning, in no way obligated by my expression of affection, and in no way pursued in any way whatsoever by me, unless you wish to be. The patron's gift of 3 winters ago was not, and is not, the property of the present Duke. It was, and is, the gift of a private creditor to a private debtor. I have written to Carmichael this morning, instructing him to enter a counterpleading at Chancery, declaring the conveyance the act of a third party of unimpeachable standing, and resisting any motion that the patron be named. If Marbury wishes to have the patron's name, he will have to have my own first. I will give him neither. I love you, Caroline. I have loved you since Sackville Street, and shall continue to love you whether you marry me or not, and shall be ashamed for the rest of my life if my ingratitude to you has cost you a single hour of further sleep. The carved horse is yours. The greatcoat was a thing I had 10 of. The gloves were of no consequence. I remain your servant, in whatever measure you will permit me to be. R. She read the letter 3 times. She set it down. She walked to the window. She lifted the carved horse from the mantel, where she had set it down the previous afternoon, before going to Lincoln's Inn, and she stood at the window with the horse in her hand and the letter on the breakfast table,
and the morning sun thinning the last of the autumn fog from the railings opposite, and she said aloud, to no one in particular, and to herself in every particular, "I have been a great fool." Stevens, across the room, permitted himself no expression of any kind. "Stevens?" "Yes, Miss Heath." "My carriage, 10:30, to Hanover Square." "Yes, Miss Heath." She did not reach Hanover Square at 10:30. At 20 minutes to 11, as she was descending the steps of her own house, a carriage, which had been waiting at the corner of Half Moon Street for some 20 minutes, moved forward and stopped at her gate, and a man in a dark coat and a hat which did not become him stepped down from the box and came up the pavement with the deliberate stride of a man who has been rehearsing his entrance for a quarter of an hour. "Miss Heath." She knew him by sight only. She had not, before this morning, exchanged a word with him. "Mr. Marbury." "You are leaving, I see." "I am." "I shall not keep you long." He bowed. He did not, in the bowing, take off his hat. "I have come to deliver a letter into your hand. I had thought to send it by my clerk. I have decided, on reflection, that it would be discourteous not to deliver it myself." He extended a sealed paper. She did not take it. "Mr. Marbury, you may send any correspondence you wish through my solicitor. I am not at leisure to receive papers in the street." "This is not a paper from my chambers, Miss Heath. It is a private letter, addressed to you, drafted by my own hand, and I will be obliged if you will read it before you depart. I will wait, if necessary, in my carriage at the curb, for the quarter of an hour it will take." She looked at him. She did, after all, take the letter. She broke the seal at the foot of her own steps. She read it. She read it a second time. She did not, in either reading, change her expression. It was a paragraph of 6 lines. It informed her that Mr. Marbury, in the course of his preparations for the December hearing, had taken the precaution of obtaining sworn statements from 2 persons in the late Viscount Heath's employ at Westmore Park concerning the unusual nature of the late Viscount's testamentary arrangements, that he had reason to believe that the principle of a certain blind trust connected with the Ravensgate estate could, by these statements, be identified to the satisfaction of the court, that he was, however, a gentleman, and was unwilling to subject any lady of his acquaintance to the indignity of a public examination, and that he was, accordingly, prepared to withdraw his motion for partition and account, in writing under his own hand, in the case that Miss Heath would do him the honour of considering an alternative arrangement with respect to the disposition of her unmarried estate. Marbury was proposing marriage. He was proposing it through the back door of a chancery threat. Caroline folded the letter very neatly along its existing fold. She handed it back to him. "Mr. Marbury." "Miss Heath." "You may keep the letter. I have memorized the substance of it. I have one question." "Madam." "The sworn statements. Are they real?" Marbury's eyes, pale, set close, the eyes of a man who had spent the morning rehearsing, did not quite hold steady. They went, for the space of a heartbeat, to the railing across the street. "They are. They are not. Madam, Mr. Marbury, my father had 4 servants at Westmore Park in the year of his death. 3 of them are deceased. The 4th is my own housekeeper and has been since I was 12. If you wish to claim that you have sworn statements from any of them, you have either forged the statements or fabricated the deponents. In either case, you have committed an indictable offence in the course of attempting to extract a private compact from me on a public pavement at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning. Good day to you." "Miss Heath, you have not considered—" "I have considered everything, Mr. Marbury, including the carriage I am about to enter. You are blocking the path between myself and that carriage. I will give you the count of 3 to step aside." He stepped aside on 2. She entered the carriage. She gave the direction to her coachman, in a voice steady enough that the coachman, who had been in her father's service for 15 years, and knew the various pitches of his mistress's voice as well as he knew the gait of the off-horse, registered for the first time in 3 years that something in the carriage above his shoulder had changed. Hanover Square. Yes, miss. The drive took 11 minutes. She did not, in any of the 11 minutes, look out of the window. She held the carved horse in her gloved hand the entire way. She arrived at Ravensgate House and was conducted to the study without a card being sent up. Ravensgate was already on his feet when she entered. He had been at the window. He looked, she noticed, as though he had not slept either. Caroline, Your Grace, I have your letter from yesterday afternoon. 3 times now. I have read it 3 times. And mine of this morning? This morning? You have not yet had it. It was to have followed me here by an hour. I imagine my courier is, at present, knocking on your front door. Marston will give it to you in due course. It says, in summary, that I have been a great fool, that I am sorry to have been one, that I read your letter at 9:30, and have spent the intervening hour discovering that I am also a great coward, and that I should be obliged if you would, on receipt of this letter, regard the conversation of yesterday morning as not entirely closed. He had not, since she entered the room, taken his eyes from her face. Caroline. Edmund Marbury was waiting at the corner of my street. What? He waited for me 20 minutes. He had a letter. He has offered to withdraw his motion at Chancery in exchange for an alternative arrangement with respect to the disposition of my unmarried estate. He has fabricated sworn statements. He intends to use them, if I refuse him, to subpoena Pinsent and identify me as the patron in open court. He has done it on a pavement, James. He has done it with witnesses passing on the other side. He is, I think, near the end of his rope. Ravensgate did not for a moment speak. He crossed to the bell-pull. He rang twice. Marsden appeared at the door. Marsden, send to Mr. Carmichael. I want him here within an hour. Send also to my cousin Lady Branscombe at Bruton Street. Inform her that I shall be obliged for her presence at 1 o'clock. Send also to Mr. Pinsent of Lincoln's Inn. Inform him that I shall require a quarter of an hour with him at 4 o'clock, and that he is to bring with him such papers as he holds, in his strong room, relating to a private matter of which he has been the steward for 3 years. And Marsden, Your Grace, 2 cups of coffee. Now. The door closed. Ravensgate turned back to her. You did not have to come. You did not have to write. Caroline. Yes. Will you marry me? Not today, not on a Wednesday at the height of a Chancery suit. On a Friday, in late December, in a church in St. James, in the presence of every person who has ever paid 3p for a copy of the Tatler's Eye. Will you marry me then, because you wish to, and not for any other reason, and not because the bargain is being struck on a pavement in Half Moon Street by a man who has fabricated witnesses? She took the carved horse from her glove. She set it on the desk between them. She put her ungloved hand upon it, the way a person sets a hand upon a Bible. On the condition, she said, that you do not, today or any day after, refer to my fortune or to my patronage as part of the bargain. The trust I made was for my brother. The fortune I have was my father's. The hand you are asking for is my own. The 3 are not the same thing. They will not be conflated. They will not be conflated in this room, or in St. James's Church, or in Chancery, or in your father's drawing room at Ravensgate when we go there at Christmas. Will you agree to that? I agree to that. Then on that condition, yes, James, I will marry you. I will marry you in St. James in late December. I will marry you in front of every 3p reader. I will marry you in any month and any church and any condition you choose. And I will, on the morning of the marriage and on every morning after, find it the easiest sentence I have ever said in my life. He came around the desk. He did not, this time, ask permission. He took her hand. He raised it to his mouth. He kissed the knuckle, and then he kissed the small flat space at the inside of the wrist where the pulse stood. And he did not let go of her fingers for what felt to both of them like a very long time, and was, in fact, the length of the second cup of coffee being poured downstairs. She did not, on that morning, leave Ravensgate House until 3:30. They sat for 2 of those hours at the desk with Carmichael, 3 with Pinsent, and the last with Lady Branscombe, who had been Ravensgate's mother's first cousin and was the most respected dowager in Hanover Square, and who, on understanding the matter in full, set down her tea, removed her gloves, and observed, in the dry middle voice she had used for the same purpose for 60 years, that there had not, in her recollection, been a more disgraceful piece of work in Chancery since the late King George had been alive, and that she would, with the Duke's permission, take it upon herself to call upon the editor of the Tatler's Eye that very afternoon and inform him that the next number of his paper would either contain a printed retraction of the paragraph of the 2nd of November, or would contain, on its first page, an open letter from herself, in which the editor would be named, the paragraph would be quoted, and the source of the paragraph would be identified by name. The editor had been, by 4:30, the second most quietly afraid man in London. The retraction appeared on the morning of the 4th. It was 3 lines long and unsigned. It expressed regret for an unverified item printed on the 2nd instant, and noted that the editor of the paper held no evidence to support the imputations of irregularity it had contained. It was the smallest retraction the editor had ever printed, and the largest, in pure consequence to him, he ever would. Marbury filed 2 further motions in the week which followed. Both were dismissed. On the 3rd motion, he ran out of money. He came, on the morning of the 18th of November, to Ravensgate House. He had not been invited. He had been informed, by a footman of his cousin's, that the Duke would be at home from 11 to 1 to such persons as wished, on personal business, to be received. He arrived at 11:20. He was not alone. Carmichael was there, Pinsent was there, Lady Branscombe was there, and Caroline was there, in a gown of dark bronze travelling silk and a fichu of bone-coloured lace, standing on the Duke's side of the long table, in the small writing room which adjoined the study. Mr. Marbury. Your Grace, Miss Heath, Lady Branscombe. You wished to speak, Edmund? Marbury did not, at first, speak. His face, which had been the face of a man arriving with a strategy, became the face of a man who had not expected the strategy's audience to be quite so well attended. He drew, at last, from his coat, a folded paper, bound at the corner with a thin cord. He laid it upon the long table. He did not slide it across. He simply placed it in front of the corner that was nearest Caroline. I have brought, he said, a written instrument. Of what character? A withdrawal. Of the motion at Chancery, signed by myself this morning, in the presence of 2 witnesses at my own chambers. The dates upon it are as of this morning. It is countersigned by my solicitor. It is, by the form of it, irrevocable. The motion is, on its delivery to the clerk of the court, abandoned. Caroline did not touch the paper. She looked, instead, at Edmund Marbury, and she said, with the careful courtesy of a woman addressing a man on her own ground, "Why?" Lady Branscombe has informed me that she is in possession of a piece of correspondence, which my own clerk had been instructed to deny existed. The piece of correspondence pertains to a forgery committed against a proxy in the year 1812, of which my father was the supposed signatory, and of which I was, regrettably, the actual signatory. The piece of correspondence is held, at present, in the strong room of Mr. Pinsent at Lincoln's Inn. I have been given to understand that it will remain there, on the condition that my motion is withdrawn this morning, and is not refiled by any party representing my interest, now, or at any future date. I have signed the withdrawal on those terms. Lady Branscombe, on the Duke's other side, inclined her head 1/4 of an inch in confirmation. Caroline lifted the paper. She unbound the cord. She turned the leaves. There were 3 leaves, written in a clerk's hand, and signed at the foot of the 3rd by Edmund Marbury, the Earl of Marbury, in a signature she had not seen before today. She read aloud, in a voice that filled the small writing room without raising itself to fill it. And I do hereby withdraw, abandon, and discontinue, in full and without reservation, the motion lodged in the Court of Chancery on the 11th day of October instant, in the matter of Marbury versus Ravensgate. And I do hereby covenant, by my hand and seal, that no successor action, motion, or proceeding shall be brought by myself, my heirs, or my representatives, against the present Duke of Ravensgate, or against the patron of the conveyance of October 1812, on any ground whatsoever, for so long as the patron and the present Duke shall live. She set the paper down. She looked up at Marbury. You will sign this also, she said, before us, on a fresh sheet, by a sentence I shall dictate. Madam, you will write the sentence in your own hand, Edmund. You will write that you regret the publication of the paragraph in the Tatler's Eye of the 2nd of November, and that the source of that paragraph was yourself. You will sign that sentence. You will date it. You will give the sheet to Lady Branscombe. She will not, while we live, publish it. She will, on the morning following our deaths, publish it at her successor's discretion, and the editor of the Tatler's Eye will have, at last, the retraction the paper ought to have printed in the first instance. Marbury stood very still. Caroline, you will address me as Miss Heath, Edmund, for the present, and as Her Grace from December the 23rd forward. He swallowed. He looked, for the smallest fraction of a second, at the table. Then he asked Carmichael for a pen. Carmichael provided one. Marbury sat. He wrote. He signed. He dated. He handed the sheet to Lady Branscombe, who folded it once, slipped it inside the inner pocket of her shawl, and said nothing. Mr. Marbury, you may go. Marbury rose. He bowed, awkwardly, to the company. He took up his hat. He left. The door closed. The room, for half a minute, said nothing. Then Lady Branscombe, in the dry middle voice she had used for 60 years, observed, He was a very stupid boy at 6, and he has gone on getting stupider. I confess I had thought he would, by 40, have steadied. I see he has not. James, my dear, ring for sherry. Carmichael, who had been a solicitor for 19 years and had heard a great many sentences of consequence spoken in his life, allowed himself, at last, the small particular smile that the late Duke would have approved of. Caroline, on the Duke's side of the table, lifted the carved horse from her reticule. She had not put it down since she had picked it up at Half Moon Street that morning, and set it gently on the table beside the withdrawn motion. It is yours, she said to James quietly. It is ours, he said. They were married on the 23rd of December at St. James's Church. The bride wore a gown of ruby silk under a fur-lined pelisse of deep amber, because the morning was bitter, and because she had, at last, decided to do at least one thing in her life for the entirely shallow pleasure of being looked at in a colour she liked. The groom wore the dark Ravensgate green, with the small carved horse stitched into the inner pocket of his coat over the place where his heart sat. Lady Branscombe sat in the front pew. Mr. Carmichael sat behind her with Mr. Pinsent. The church was full. The Tatler's Eye, by some quiet arrangement with its editor, did not, on the day following, print a paragraph of any kind upon the matter. Christmas at Ravensgate was the small one which the present Duke's modest income permitted, and was the largest one which the house had seen in a quarter of a century. Snow fell on the morning of the 26th. The carved horse stood on the mantel of the library between two bayberry candles. The library fire was lit. The new Duchess sat at one end of the long settle, with a volume of Coleridge upon her lap, and the Duke sat at the other end, and at some point in the late afternoon the volume of Coleridge slid from the Duchess's lap to the floor, because she had fallen asleep with her ribbon ungathered at her throat, and the Duke, finding this so unprecedented that he did not for a moment know what to do about it, gathered the ribbon for her, and lifted the volume, and held them both until she woke at the chime of 5, and discovered that she had, for the first time in 11 weeks, slept without dreaming once of a paragraph in the Tatler's Eye. James, my love, read me the next page, will you? He read her the next page. He read her, in fact, the next 11. The snow went on falling. The Bayberry candles burned down. The carved horse on the mantel, between them, stood with its one chipped ear at the angle Robert Heath had, with the patience of a boy of 14, intended. And the man whose father had held that boy at Mont Saint-Jean read aloud to the woman who had paid the debts that boy's last letter had asked her to pay. And neither of them, in the long, quiet hour before dinner was announced, said a single word about the matter. It was not, on this particular evening, a matter which required to be said. It had, at long last, simply been done.